All right, so in this section, we're going to be covering the brain, and we're going to be focusing first on kind of the overall structure of the brain, and then we're going to go into some of our subcortical structures. All right, so we've covered the peripheral nervous system, but again, now we're going to be focusing on the brain and the spinal cord specifically, and really where the brain and the spinal cord meet. But before we do that, I'd like you to go check out this TED Talk video. I have it in the Chapter 2 playlist. It's called What is So Special About the Human Brain? Go watch that. It's like 15 minutes, but I guarantee you're going to learn a whole lot. It's excellent, and there's a weird moment in the middle. I hope you enjoy. So go ahead and do that and then come back. All right. So, if you look at different species, the brains are organized a little bit differently. So we have the human on the upper left, elephants on the top right, dolphins on the bottom left, and then gorillas, dogs, cats, mice, macaques. Macaques are a type of monkey. And you can kind of see that their structure, while there are some similar parts, they are a little bit different. And these are all mammals, obviously. But as you can see, like dolphins have really different structure, and same thing with elephants. Like different parts of their brain are larger or smaller, kind of depending on some of their specifications for their species, like what they actually have to do. Also, their orientation. So most of these animals walk on four legs, and so their spinal cord kind of comes out the back of their brain versus the bottom of the brain like we do. Like our spinal cord is tucked underneath towards the back of our brain versus coming straight out the back to then link up with the spine for then to be on all fours. So we're bipedal, so our spine has to come straight down from the back of our brain. But if you've watched the TED Talk video, you'll understand kind of what makes our brain different than other species. And it has to do, a little spoiler alert, has to do with the size of the neurons and the number of the neurons within the brain. And not necessarily the size of the brain, because other animals have larger brains than us. Elephants, a lot of different whales have larger brains than us. But it doesn't mean that they're smarter than us. It has to do a little bit relative to the size of their body. But even when you account for that, humans have more neurons than any other animals. And they're going to talk about how that came to be in the video. So again, if you haven't watched it, go watch it. Okay, so if you look at a brain, either in an MRI, a CT scan, PET scan, or if you cut into a person's brain, if you have that chance, excuse me, you'll see these like C-shaped cavities in the brain, and these are called the ventricles. And these ventricles hold cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this cerebrospinal fluid is kind of like a lymphatic fluid. It's pretty watery, but it's not exactly as viscous as actual water. There's a little bit more hold to it, but that part, it has a couple different features. It cushions our brain, so it kind of acts as like water airbags in our brains that allow our brain to kind of move around. And even if you bump your head, like there's going to be some shock absorption there. And it also is part of like with that fluid exchange that helps clean out our brain as we go about our day. So neurons that are damaged or neurotransmitters that have kind of floated loose, they can actually like move through with that cerebrospinal fluid, and then that gets reabsorbed into our body. The cerebrospinal fluid also travels in a canal, the fourth ventricle they call it, down into our spinal column. So if you've ever heard of someone having a spinal tap done, typically what doctors are doing is they're going in between the vertebrae of their spine with a large needle. It's not a pleasant experience, and they will actually remove some of this cerebrospinal fluid. They typically will do this to check for infection. So they could have bacteria or viruses in that fluid that could be harmful. So meningitis, HIV, things like that are actually in that cerebrospinal fluid. And they can check for that. Also different pressures and things like that. It's really interesting. The fluid's actually generated by the ventricles themselves. And They are on both halves of the brain. We're talking about this structure, but our brain has two halves to it, the two hemispheres, and they're inside both of them. So if you ever look at an MRI, you'll see these dark spots in the middle, and that's not a bad thing. That's actually the ventricle space. So here's kind of what it looks like. You see the lateral ventricle, that's the big like C-shaped one, the third ventricle, which is the one in the middle, and the fourth ventricle, which begins at the base of the brain and it goes down through your spinal column. So here's some of our overall structures of the brain. Our cerebral cortex is typically what we think of when we talk about the brain. That's got our different lobes that allow us to see, hear, and think. But we have other lobes of our brain, or other aspects of our brain that are really important for basic functioning. So let's start at the very bottom. We have our spinal cord that meets up with our brain stem. So at the very, very bottom of the picture, below where it says medulla, that's where the spinal cord meets the brain. But the medulla, reticular formation, pons, and midbrain, they make up what we call the brain stem. That's kind of like the layman's term for it. The very bottom is the medulla. The middle section is the pons, and that's got this like bulbous little section in the middle of it. And then our midbrain connects the higher level cerebral cortex part of our brain to our spinal cord. And then in the middle of this, the core of it is the reticular formation. It's a slightly different structure. And then we have our cerebellum on the back. That is for motor function. We're going to talk about that a whole lot more. Has some learning and memory stuff going on in there, but a lot of motor coordination. If you cut into one, you can kind of see the structure here. It looks kind of like a tree. I believe like the Greek root for cerebellum has to do with the tree or something, but it's got this like really weird like pulpy kind of look to it. And then on the inside, in the very middle, we have our thalamus. These are some of our subcortical structures, and we're going to be going into those a whole lot more later on. But let's first let me explain what the midbrain, pons, reticular formation, and medulla are responsible for. So the hindbrain is another word for what we call the brain stem. It's composed of medulla, pons, and cerebellum. Again, that cerebellum is the pulpy part in the back, sits right at the base of your head. The medulla is what merges with the spinal cord. It contains large bundles of axons that travel to and from the higher levels of the brain. So it's kind of like a big relay section. It also manages essential functions for life, including heart rate, blood pressure, and if you damage that area, it typically will result in death. If you've ever heard of someone who's broken their spine, sometimes will ask, like, well, where was it? Was it in the middle of the back, the lower back, or was it up in the neck? And if they get their cervical vertebrae, which is the ones in the neck, typically that person will have severe impact, whether it's paralysis of all or most of their limbs, all the way to death. So if someone breaks their neck, it's pretty much you're going to die or you're going to have some very severe consequences. There was a famous actor, Christopher Reeve, back in the 90s. He played Superman. He was like the big heartthrob of the 90s. Kind of looked like JFK. He played Superman. He was in a bunch of movies. Was super famous, and he used to ride horses and like do like equestrian stuff, like where he would jump different hurdles and stuff with the horse. And in one of his jumps, the horse bucked him off, and the way he fell, he actually broke his neck, and he became quadriplegic. And what that means is that he couldn't move his arms or his legs, and he also didn't have control over his lungs anymore, so he couldn't breathe on his own. So he had to be put on a respirator. And he was able to talk through, so he had a tracheotomy where like they have a hole in the throat because, again, he can't control his lungs, so he had to have a machine do it. But then they could block that, and he had enabled him to talk and to speak normally, but he had to like then stop, breathe, and then speak again. He also, because he couldn't move his hands, he was in a specialized wheelchair that he was able to, I believe he used like something on his tongue, like in his mouth, to actually move his wheelchair around. He became a really big advocate for spinal cord injury research, and so through the contributions to his foundation, they've really learned a whole lot about how to treat and how to help someone that has had a spinal cord injury. Now, he passed away years ago, due to like complications. I think he had like an infection from the bed sores and stuff from laying down, and he was never really himself again. But his wife still works really hard to make sure that the research for his foundation is still continuing. If you look into him, he's a really famous man who had a severe spinal cord injury. Um, so yeah, he probably broke just below the medulla. So if you were to damage that section, your heart rate and blood pressure can't be controlled anymore, and therefore you're not going to survive. Just above that, we have the pons, and that has to do with the management of sleep, arousal, again, just being alert and awake or allowing yourself to calm down, and some basic facial expressions. And that will help connect the cerebellum with the rest of the brain. So the cerebellum, again, is this part in the back, and it has to connect to the pons, and that's where it kind of sticks. And if we go further, the cerebellum is essential for, again, that's the part in the back. It maintains our balance and motor coordination, including posture and muscle tone. So your ability to walk upright and not flop over or bump into things is in part due to your cerebellum. It also stores memories related to skills and habits that are physical in nature. So athletes actually typically have larger cerebellums because they're more physically skilled at controlling their body and their muscles. So especially athletes that have to do a lot of like really complicated body positions like gymnasts, they have bigger cerebellums than average citizens. But drinking alcohol actually affects the cerebellum first, because that's where you see the loss of muscle coordination and that tipsiness, that unbalance that people who are intoxicated have, and that's because it's affecting that cerebellum in the back. We also are now seeing that the cerebellum is involved with wider ranges of functioning, including language, cognition, and perception. So it's got some other deeper functioning that we still don't know a whole lot about, but researchers are looking into. All right, and then above the pons, let's go back to the image real quick. So above the pons, we have our midbrain, and the midbrain contains structures that are involved in sensory reflexes, movement, and pain. So the reticular formation, that's that part in the core of our brainstem. That runs the length of the brainstem's core from the upper medulla into the midbrain. It participates in the control of mood, arousal, and sleep, and it involves reflexes such as breathing, sneezing, coughing, and vomiting. So the fact that you can, like, your body automatically breathes, sneezing and coughing are reflexes, and vomiting, again, you can't always stop that. That's all related to your reticular formation. So those are the structures of our hindbrain. So now we're going to be talking about some of the subcortical structures. And so, okay, the cortex, again, is that big part on the top of the brain that's got all the cool maze-like structure with all the wrinkles and folds. But underneath that, there are actually some really important structures that we're going to be talking about. And we're going to start off talking about your thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the amygdala. So the thalamus is the two-halves section that sits right in the middle of your brain. It kind of looks like a clam. Like a clamshell with two halves kind of sitting next to each other. The basal ganglia is this long, thin structure that has these like little pieces that kind of go down into the thalamus. That kind of like reach in, they stabilize it. And then our amygdala is like little like pea-sized shaped. It's not red in real life. These are all colored for visualization purposes. Like your organs, like they're not like multicolored things. Like our countries on a map. They're not all different colors. So our amygdala is a little pea-shaped little ball at the end of the basal ganglia. We're going to talk about that a couple of times in this chapter. So these three structures, our thalamus, basal ganglia, and amygdala, they make up what we call our limbic system. Early anatomists were first calling it the emotional brain because it has to do a lot with emotion, but it's more broad now as we've learned more about the structure of the brain. We don't usually call it the emotional brain so much anymore, but you might hear some instructors in the future, if you take a neuroscience class, calling it the emotional brain. But we're going to be calling it the limbic system. And again, these are subcortical structures. So the first one is the thalamus. It's referred to as the gateway to the cortex because it takes input from our visual systems, so our eyes, ears, sense of touch in our hands and throughout our body, as well as taste. And it first gets relayed from that sensory organ to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends the signals on to the part of the cortex on the outside of the brain that actually is going to manage that information and make sense of it. So it also is involved in basic memory processes and some states of states of consciousness. So if you're awake, asleep, intoxicated, like that regulation oftentimes will come from the thalamus. Our basal ganglia, again, you can see where it's pointing here. It's a collection of large structures that are involved with voluntary movement, so your ability to actually move your body willingly. If a person has degeneration of the basal ganglia, we typically will see Parkinson's disease, which is when involuntary movement becomes extremely difficult. So people with Parkinson's, they begin to have tremors, so their hands will begin to shake. They can't control their voice anymore. They can't control their legs and their feet. Like their muscles begin to kind of tense up involuntarily. And typically we see degeneration of the basal ganglia. If you watch the video of the brain surgery with a placebo in the last chapter, what they were doing is called deep brain stimulation surgery. So what they do is they put electrodes in, and kind of like where the line is that points out the basal ganglia from the little label, they will put a long electrode down in, touching the basal ganglia, and that electrode will be turned on, and it will help regulate the firing of the basal ganglia, essentially shutting off or like turning down the symptoms of Parkinson's for a period of time. So that's really important. And these types of surgeries are becoming more important, not just for Parkinson's, but for a variety of different mental health disorders, such as depression even. So deep brain stimulation is getting a lot of attention now, and there's a lot of research being done with that. So involvement of basal ganglia is also suspected in a number of other conditions, including OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Again, it has to do with a lot of that voluntary movement stuff. And then our amygdala appears to have a role in identifying, remembering, and responding to fear and aggression. And it's our basic emotional processing center. If you've watched the movie Inside Out and you see the different characters with the different emotions, sadness, disgust, joy, and anger, there's one more, or sadness, there we go. Essentially, that's part of the amygdala that learns how to respond to fear. And we're going to be talking about it shortly, but the amygdala bumps right up against the part of the brain that's responsible for memory storage. So our memories and our emotions are very closely linked, both in space and in how we experience them. So just like when sadness is touching the marbles in Inside Out and turning them blue and essentially wrapping them in sadness after the fact. That's kind of what our brain is doing, obviously not with actual marbles and characters, but emotions are highly linked to our memory system. So the systems are right next to each other, and they work in tandem to remember things. All right, so here are some of our other structures that we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about the hypothalamus, the cingulate cortex, anterior and posterior, and our hippocampus. All right, so our hypothalamus is a collection of structures at the very kind of base where, we already talked about the thalamus with that little clamshell in the middle, but underneath that's a little section. It's involved with motivation and homeostasis and regulates body functions such as temperature, thirst, hunger, biological rhythms, and sexual activities. Now, the thing I like to tell students, help them remember it, is the hypothalamus is involved in the 4 F's. Feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. Did you get the joke? So feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating with a big wink. Now I could say fornication, but it's funnier to say mating and watch the wheels turn. So again, temperature, thirst, hunger, biological rhythms, and sexual activity are all motivated and driven by our hypothalamus. So it helps direct our autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system and our hormones, all within that little subcomponent of our brain. So this hypothalamus is critically important. So it tells the autonomic nervous system essentially to do its automatic functioning. It also talks to our endocrine system, which releases hormones. So it'll tell the brain or the body when it needs to start growing, when puberty needs to begin, when we need to stop growing, when we need to lactate, when we need to release hormones due to fear or because we ate something really sugary. So all of that's controlled by our hypothalamus. So it's a really important component of our brain. Next is our hippocampus. This is the component that actually relates to the formation of long-term memory storage. So it's involved in the storage and retrieval of memories located elsewhere in the brain as well. So it's kind of like the central relay system for memory. And so the amygdala is that little red cherry looking thing, and then our hippocampus is a C-shaped structure that starts off and kind of thick down by the amygdala and then tapers off as it kind of moves around the basal ganglia. And it's called the hippocampus because hippocampus means seahorse in Greek. And if you actually look at a hippocampus that's been removed from a human brain, it looks a lot like a seahorse. So I know that's a lovely image, but hopefully you'll remember that. So hippocampus means seahorse in Greek. And it kind of sits right there and it kind of curls around where that little purple structure is right there. So it's really important for memory systems. All right, and then we have our cingulate cortex, which is broken down into two sections, the anterior and posterior. The forward 2/3 is known as anterior. Anterior means front. Participates with the hypothalamus in the control of the autonomic nervous system. The anterior cingulate cortex is also important for decision making, emotion, anticipation of reward, as well as empathy. And then the back third is called the posterior cingulate cortex, participates in memory and visual processing. And again, so the posterior is closer to the hippocampus, anterior is closer to the hypothalamus. And so the components of our brain actually typically are situated right next to the components that they have to talk to most frequently. So it actually, the design kind of makes some sense once you begin to know the different aspects. You know, the way our brain evolved was to be efficient and to make sure that we're not going to be wasting energy in really long transmissions unless it's absolutely necessary. All right, so like I mentioned before, our brain is made up of two halves. These are called our cerebral hemispheres. And so we have a left and a right hemisphere. If we look at the image on the right-hand side here, you'll kind of see the two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And then you can kind of see like the brain split straight down the middle on the left-hand side. Now the two halves of the brain are connected through a structure called the corpus callosum. This corpus callosum is a bunch, like a whole bunch of axons that travel back and forth. They call it the highway, like the bridge between the two hemispheres. And these axons kind of just relay this information from the left side to the right side and back and forth. And this is really important for a lot of our functioning because both halves of the brain have slightly specialized functions, and if they can't talk to one another, we see some strange things that occur. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to have a video in the playlist to kind of show you what's going on with that some more. So above our brainstem, we find two large cerebral hemispheres. This is typically what we think about when we're talking about the human brain. That corpus callosum, again, is that large bundle of axons that connects these two hemispheres. And then the cerebral cortex is that thin layer of cells that covers the outer surface of our cerebral hemisphere. So I'm going to go back to this image. So you see, it says here, the white matter, which is the inside stuff, that's the axons. Again, that's that myelinated fatty tissue. Essentially the cables that are running between the neurons, and the gray matter is the cell bodies, and the cell bodies kind of sit on the outside, and then all their internal connections kind of go in towards the center to interconnect the different parts of the brain. And then the cerebrum, hypothalamus, and thalamus are all collectively referred to as our forebrain. So the forebrain means like the top, the front stuff that we're going to be talking about. So the forebrain. And our brain is organized laterally. So lateralization is the specialization of abilities for our left and our right hemispheres. The left hemisphere of our brain does a little bit different tasks and skills than our right hemisphere. And it's important for us to understand that our brain is, and this is a funny word, but it's contralaterally organized. That means that things that happen to the right side of our body is controlled by the left hemisphere of our brain. Things that are being done with our left side of our body, so say you're moving your left hand to pick up your phone, that's actually being controlled by the right half of your brain. So everything switches when it gets up to your brain, what side it's affected. So if you have damage to your right hemisphere, so say you had a really bad car accident and the right half of your brain was damaged, you're not going to be able to move the left side of your body very well. You might have a limp, you might not be able to use your hands, you may have problem with your face on the left side, it may droop. So that's the contralateralization. So damage to one hemisphere can cause a problem called spatial neglect. So there's a couple famous cases where these people had this really severe spatial neglect, and they would people who have this act that they can't see half of a display. So for an example, there's a woman who was in a care facility because she had this, and she had a plate of food and she would only eat. So let's say she had a problem with the right half of her brain. She could see the left half, but she would completely ignore what was on the right because that was the side that she had the damage on the right, so she couldn't see on the left, so she would only eat the right half of her plate. And then she would complain, like, she's like, they don't give me enough food here. I'm starving. I'm hungry. And all it took was someone actually moving her plate, like turning it around 180 degrees, that allowed her to see the other half. It's not that they don't have any damage to their eyes, but they just can't attend to that side because there's been damage to that side of the brain. In other cases, they do what's called a split brain operation. That's when a person, typically because they have severe epilepsy, they'll have their corpus callosum severed. So they'll actually go down right between the two halves of the brain, and they will cauterize and cut the corpus callosum, so that superhighway that connects the two hemispheres. And in different testing situations, they can determine how the hemispheres can handle information. So normally, if you have a normal brain without a corpus callosum that's been severed, if you look at a display, one half of the brain will override it. Typically your left hemisphere, because that's the part that does language and speech. It actually usually overrides a lot of what's going on the right. So your brain works together. But for these patients, if you show them something only on one half of a screen, their other half of the brain hasn't seen it. So let's say you have them look at, you're going to see this in the video, but they look at a point in the middle of the screen, have a little X that they have to look at, and then they show them something on the right side of the screen very quickly. Now, because we're contralaterally organized, the left side of the brain, because it was displayed on the right, the left side of the brain actually is what's seeing it. And then they'll ask them to write down what they saw, and they can write down, again, with their right hand, what they just saw. But if you ask them to draw it, because the right side has to do with the artistic expression, they can't draw. They can only write it down. They can say it. But if you switch the sides, they won't actually see it on the right side. They won't even having recognized that they saw it. But then if you ask them to draw it with their left hand now, because they saw it on the other side, they actually can do it. You're going to see this in the video. Take a look. Watch it. It's a patient Joe. It's absolutely fascinating and kind of cool how our brain can handle this type of damage and overcome it. And talking to a person who's had a split brain operation, you would never know that anything was wrong with them or that they'd had this operation. It's not until you look into these finer tuned displays of their abilities do you actually see changes. So the left and the right brain. So for the left brain, 95% of us use the left hemisphere for language. So that can include speaking, writing, and understanding language. We also do math on the left side, judgment of time and rhythm, coordination of complex movements, such as speech. For most of us, that happens on the left side of the brain. Now, for most of us, if you are a right-handed person, which is most people, about 90% of people are right-handed, it's 97% of us. But left-handed people, they have a higher chance of actually having that swapped, where they will do the speech information will be on the right side. But typically, if someone's doing brain research, they only get right-handed people because there's a higher chance of things getting all messed up if you're testing lefties. So it's actually kind of a really interesting bias in neurological research, is they only use right-handed people. That's another discussion. So the right hemisphere, if the left is controlling language, then the right has some simple words and numbers, but they're really good at pattern recognition, understanding faces, melodies, puzzles, drawing pictures, expressing and detecting emotions, understanding jokes, irony, sarcasm, implications, and metaphors. So while the left side can understand speech and writing and understanding basic things like that, they can't understand sarcasm and jokes and metaphors they're not going to understand the artistic expression that can be done in writing. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of this. So if you look, so in the center, here's our examples, and then on the left side, I was going to say what the left hemisphere would understand, and on the right, what they would understand, what the right hemisphere would understand. So if you see this shape of the L made up of the small letter D, so the left hemisphere is going to see the details. It's going to see the letter D, but they're not going to see the overall shape. The right hemisphere, though, will see that overall shape of the L. If you look at the middle example, a stitch in time saves 9. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, or don't look a gift horse in the mouth, or a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. The left hemisphere is going to be like, oh, a stitch in time saves 9. That's about sewing. But the right hemisphere is going to understand a small effort saves time later. And then if you look at the bottom example, this mosaic picture of the eye, the left side is going to see, or it's a bunch of blobs and dots and a bunch of little squares. The right side, though, they're going to see the eye. They're going to see that overall pattern. Another example I've heard is someone says, oh, my heart was heavy. We understand that means like, wow, that person's sad, or they're feeling something really deep. The right hemisphere understands that metaphor, but the left hemisphere is like, oh, what's wrong with your heart? Like, why does it weigh so much? It just can't understand the true meaning of that phrase without the right hemisphere, that artistic expression kind of half. Now, you've probably seen pictures and t-shirts, and I've seen like cell phone covers and laptop like covers. They'll be like, the right hemisphere is like all this beautiful color and artistic beauty, and the left hemisphere is like numbers and digital stuff. And it's not exactly how it is. You need both hemispheres to talk to one another all the time. And even people are like, oh, I'm right-brained or I'm left-brained. No, that's all crap. Everyone is right and left-brained unless you've had a hemisphere removed, like the girl in the video. You have to have both hemispheres in order to do your day-to-day stuff. So even a person who's artistic, they use their left hemisphere to organize the process in which they're going to complete their art. Even if you're a really detailed person and you code all day and like you love math, to understand the jokes that your friends are saying or the memes that they're sharing, that's your right hemisphere. So you need both halves in order to be a fully human person, unless you've had half your brain removed as a child and then your brain is plastic and can overcome these things. But for a typical person, you have to have both hemispheres working together all the time. All right, so I'm going to stop here. I hope you check out the videos in the playlist, because I think that's going to help you understand the implications of some of the things we've just talked about. In our next section, we're actually going to be talking about the cerebral cortex.